Thank you so much. So welcome everybody to this panel. We have 4 papers and 100 minutes. So I hope every panelist would speak for no more than 20 minutes, and we'll have at least 5 minutes for a discussion of each paper. Our first panelist is Michael Broyde, who is a professor of law at Emory University School of Law, and is also the director for the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory. He has published extensively, numerous books, many articles. He has his ordination from Yeshiva University, as well as a law degree from NYU. And it's my pleasure to introduce him, and he will speak on the topic, Jewish law, COVID responses from Asher to Zelig, and many stops along the way. Professor Broyde.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to be heretical and speak without a PowerPoint presentation. I figure, what's the point of lecturing while you're reading? I'm just going to speak for about 20 minutes about my sense of how Jewish law has responded to the pandemic. And I'm going to aim to do so in a way that allows the program to post my PowerPoint somewhere so that as a lecturer, the person watches the lecture, if they want to access the PowerPoints, they can, but we'll treat it like class and not let everybody just download the PowerPoints and pay no attention to the lecture. That's a common student activity we all know. And maybe this will be a little more interesting for everybody else. Jewish law is, I guess, in the context of this conversation, an all-inclusive term called halacha that's intended to mean the way. And part of the process of the way is having emergency rules. Justice Jackson famously observed that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and the Jewish law is not a suicide pact either. We don't want or expect that Jewish law will induce people into ending their life other than for a few and very serious matters, none of which are touched on in the course of a pandemic, particularly, as Professor Wolpe pointed out in his first lecture, a pandemic essentially, at least in the United States, devoid of anti-Semitic overtones. Interestingly enough, it's in Israel where anti-Semitism becomes an issue, but in the United States, other than a few anomalous exceptions, there was little that we would describe as anti-Semitism, notwithstanding one sharp comment from the mayor of New York. But there's no doubt that what we had here was an emergency. The United States seemed on the cusp of a recession or worse. There was high unemployment, shortage of health care, not enough respirators. Israel was entering into the Passover holiday in a virtual lockdown with travel restricted to no more than 100 meters. And Jewish life in general was incredibly contracted. Synagogues, schools, yeshivas were all closed. Everything that could go on Zoom did go on Zoom. And everything seemed to be heading into a doomsday situation. People who had gotten incredibly used to the sociology that they were living in were now pushed to be extremely lonely. Furthermore, unlike other more desperate situations in other times, the Crusades or the Holocaust, and this pandemic was nowhere near as dangerous, there was no anti-Semitism at play here, and thus you didn't have to ponder the survival of the Jewish community, really. Really, all you had to ponder was the survival of the human community, Jewish or otherwise, out there. And the question was how to obey Jewish law in this environment. And I want to compare and contrast two Jewish law authorities. There were many who issued decisions in this time, but I have an interest in contrasting two of them, one in America, one in Israel, both important Jewish law authorities who were integrally involved in large and substantial communities. One was Rabbi Usher Weiss, who serves as a significant Jewish law authority, both in the Haredi and the Hasidic and the modern Orthodox community in Israel, reflecting the breadth of his intellectual popularity. He serves as the final halachic authority of a major hospital in Israel and is an interesting authority in his own right. And the second is Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who serves as the final halachic authority for the OU. Both are technologically connected people, and both issued about 100 tshuvot, about 100 responsa in the course of the pandemic, addressing a variety of different issues in their community, many of which were deeply overlapping. And I guess the first question that we should ask is, why would anybody issue responsa rather than something else? And this, it's a worthwhile 2-minute conversation to just review. There are 6 different styles of rabbinic writing. One is to write Talmudic commentaries. Think about Rashi or Tosfot. Another is to write codes. Think about Maimonides' Mishnah Torah or Rabbi Caro's Shulchan Aruch. The third is to write cases. Think some things like Piskei Din Rabbani, proceedings of the Israeli rabbinical courts, biblical commentaries like, again, Rashi on Chumash, or Responsa. And like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef or Rabbi Moshe Feinstein issued. But there's another kind of responsa out there, and I think these responsa of these 2 Jewish law authorities fit well into that category. These are emergency responsa, letters written in response to unusual situations, and they allow you to say and do things that are very much parametered by the reality around you. Some of them come close to advocating a suspension of Jewish law, or maybe they're just extremely fact-specific, or some of them the authority confesses, I'm not sure the right answer, but emergency requires that some answer be given. So I want to provide you with an authoritative answer that you can rely on, even though I'm not sure. Responsa have always had an element of emergency to them, at least certain responsa and certain kinds of vehicles. I suspect that both of these Jewish law authorities wrote responsa because they wanted to acknowledge that they were treading uncertainly, and future generations might read what they wrote and say, oh, these are mistaken. And these were intended to be somewhat temporary rules to govern somewhat unusual situations. That's itself sort of interesting. Sometimes, as our previous speaker said, emergencies allow you to not adhere to the rules, but break all the rules, because that's something that an emergency permits. Jewish law recognizes that as well. Jewish law certainly recognizes the right to suspend law in an exigent situation. Maybe what we have here is an exigent situation, and emergency times require emergency responses. And the only thing you want to make sure of is you want everybody to know that what you're doing is grounded in the emergency, so you issue emergency responsa. And Rabbi Usher Weiss, who issues 3 volumes of standalone responsa, and another volume is coming, I suspect will edit these collections of responsa and take out many of them from his permanent legacy. He's a Kloisenberger Chassid, the director of the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, the halacha director of the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, and has indicated here and there in conversation that some of the things that he wrote were intended to be temporary rather than permanent. And that itself sort of is an interesting idea. One of the things you do in an exigent situation is you do emergency things. And he addresses a variety of contemporary issues that popped into his and many other communities. I'm going to focus on two of them in just a minute and compare and contrast his view with the view of Rabbi Herschel Schachter from Yeshiva University, but just sort of a read through his 100 Responsa, tell you sort of what he's dealing with and what his community is approaching. A famous letter addresses the question of a physician who doesn't want to go to work because he's afraid of getting sick, and the sickness will make his family ill. Another Responsa addresses the question of delaying a bris, selling chametz via the internet, immersing in the mikveh during the day rather than at night as is customary to better allow pandemic circumstances, or the numerous questions relating to quarantine in various religious settings, or even such questions as whether a person who's suffering from COVID right now and can't taste anything is obligated to eat maror, the bitter herb, during the Passover Seder. Mundane and grand questions. And of course, he spends a considerable amount of time on a topic I will return to, which is how do you conduct distant Torah readings? Rabbi Herschel Schachter from Yeshiva University also issued about 100 letters, a little bit fewer. He's a college-educated Rosh Kollel at Yeshiva University, widely perceived to be the heir of Rabbi Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University, the final halachic authority in the OU, and not a person who heretofore had issued Responsa, had issued a few volumes of scholarship, but no Responsa, but yet in the middle of the pandemic, starts writing regular Responsa that are deeply exigent, reflecting his sense that what we have here is an emergency, and he's going to step out of his normally conservative role, and indeed his Responsa are lacking any sense of his normal conservatism. He too, like Rabbi Weiss, addresses triage in medical decisions. He addresses the needs of the physically and mentally ill on Pesach and Shabbat. His letters about the mentally ill are particularly touching. As the world closes down, people who are in need of the community around them found themselves increasingly forsook by the community around them. And Rabbi Schachter writes at great length about the nature of that emergency and permits violations of Jewish law to prevent suicide. He addresses questions of burial, getting married without a minyan present. Like Rabbi Weiss, he addresses making up how to run a minyan during social distancing, a topic I will come back to focus on. And I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about two questions that they both overlap on. Should we try to save as many people as possible by withdrawing treatment from one person who's, if you want me to use a non-Jewish word, hogging more than their fair share of the resources? Can we take somebody off a respirator who's inevitably going to die in order to allow that respirator to be given to a person who will live if they're put on a respirator? This question arose repeatedly in New York and in other places in the United States as well, where for many weeks there was an acute respirator shortage. Both Rabbi Schachter and Rabbi Weiss discussed this question. And if you think about it, It's a damned no matter what you do question. Either you're going to authorize the killing of one person, or you're going to insist that that person get more than their reasonable share of resources to die a death later on, and other people will die. No matter what you will do, there will be blood on your hands. And Rabbi Asher Weiss, following the view that I call the view of the Meiri, although many others take him, seems to permit saving the largest number of people. And Rabbi Herschel Schachter, following the view of Rabbi Soloveitchik and many others, seems inclined to be of the view that there are no situations in which a murder is permitted, even to save large numbers of people. At some level, this is an easy dispute in the following sense. It's a very ancient dispute of which there's ample precedent to have. And although it's a heart-rending question, it's a question that many before the two of them have addressed. What makes this case novel almost is the utter lack of anti-Semitism in the question. Previous situations almost all involved responses to anti-Semitism, and here the questions have no anti-Semitic overtone at all. A more interesting question from my perspective is the contrast the two authorities take on distant aliyot. How to conduct a Torah reading when people are far apart. There's no reason why you cannot conduct a minyan on a baseball field. I went to a few myself. It's easy to put 10 people far apart on a baseball field. From home plate to first base is 90 feet, they tell me as a child. And you can surround your minyan with players on the baseball field and put the bima where the pitcher stands. But you can't get an aliyah. Nobody was prepared to go up to get an aliyah. So what do you do when nobody stands together? And this is a fascinating area of intellectual contrast. Rabbi Schachter adopts the view that we should go back to the Talmudic rule, which is when only one person can read Torah, that Torah reader should get all 7 aliyot. And that it is better to go back to the Talmudic precedent than to do anything else. You'll have a Torah reading with a minyan present and only one olah. Only one person will get up and get all 7 aliyot. Rabbi Asher Weiss, more inclined to think by analogy, I think, is inclined to take the view that no. A person who's forced to stand far away from Torah reading is somewhat analogous to a blind person. And the Maharil tells us that our practice in medieval periods is that we do give aliyot to blind people, and that why should we distinguish between a blind person and a person who's not at all blind but can't see the Torah for medical reasons, and that we Ashkenazim, or maybe we all, should follow the Maharil's innovation, which says when there's a Torah reader, really anybody can get aliyot, and that the Talmudic rule is limited to situations in which there is no Torah reading. And this, of course, is very fascinating for a different historical reason. This is almost a tale of 2 pandemics. The Maharil's reading of Jewish law and the rise of the Baal Koreh, the rise of the Torah reader, historians suspect came back in great popularity due to the Black Death, the Black Plague, which decimated the Jewish communities, caused the abandonment of yeshivot, and produced generations of illiterates. And The Maharil student, Rabbi Trani, notes that even the great communities in Europe frequently only had one or two people who could comfortably read Torah. And this reinforced for us the institution of the Torah reader, since I would have a community very similar to our modern Jewish communities, in which nobody really can get up and read Torah. It's only in Yemen where the social expectations are everybody knows how to read Torah. In modern America, and even to some extent in modern Israel, Torah reading is a skill. And this is an interesting idea, which is, this is a tale of two pandemics. The last great pandemic we had was the Black Plague, and the legacy of the Black Plague is still playing out in the 21st century discussion of how to conduct Torah reading in a modern day pandemic. And of course,
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
What we haven't figured out is what innovations that arose in the pandemic are here to stay. Pandemics produce innovation. Of course they do. But what we don't know is what's here to stay. Some of them are gone already. That's the most interesting thing. The pandemic isn't over, but some of the innovations are done. On the other hand, some of the innovations are still continuing. I have yet to attend synagogue with a sermon. I joked with one of my children that I go to synagogue praying that the pandemic wiped out the sermon forever. I'm not sure if that's a worthwhile prayer or not, but maybe the era of great sermons is over. And then there are other changes that are clearly coming to Jewish law that started in the pandemic, that are not just social changes, but enormous, significant technical changes in Jewish law. We have yet to see, or yet to seriously ponder, which of the pandemic emergency regulations will still be with us when the pandemic is still over. We're too enmeshed in the middle of the crisis to ask what's our post-crisis plan. But I have no doubt that we're watching a period of enormous innovation in Jewish law, and some of the innovations are here to stay, and their pandemic origins will only be remembered by historians. They will become normal in Jewish law. I gave a Dvar Torah sermon Rishul every Shabbat. I don't doubt that at all, Rabbi Magid, but I won't go there. I think it was uncommon, maybe through Zoom, but not live. So I think we're yet to figure out whether the pandemic is going to introduce deep-seated change that will still be living within 100 years, or it will all be gone. Thank you all very much. I welcome comments, and I'm looking forward to hearing very much from my other panelists. Thank you, Joel, for moderating.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your timely, in both senses of the term, presentation. I love your comment about Tfilat Shav, about not having sermons, but we'll leave that for another time. It's my pleasure to introduce now Dr. Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is the rector at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Rabbi Dorff is, I think, well known to everybody in this group. He has written extensively on many aspects of Halakha, conservative Judaism, and bioethics. He received his PhD in philosophy from Columbia and his rabbinic ordination from JTS. Elliot, my pleasure to have you speak on the topic conservative Judaism and its response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So very much in line with what Michael was just talking about. The pandemic obviously raised all kinds of questions in Jewish law for the conservative movement as well. Interestingly, it required a lot of emergency tshuvot along the lines that he was talking about. In other words, not like the usual practice that we have of a tshuvah can take 2 years to ultimately, be produced, but rather things that needed to be addressed right away. And interestingly, the medical pieces of this were pretty straightforward for us. I mean, that you have to abide by what medical authorities say in regard to social distancing and masks, that you must get vaccinated unless you have a medical reason not to be, that there is no Jewish reason to avoid being vaccinated. Again, aside from people who have medical reasons for not being vaccinated. Those kinds of things were pretty clear very quickly once the vaccine came on. We also had a debate about triage, originally in regard to ventilators. This goes back to April and May of 2020, when Rabbi Daniel Nevins and I, we both have long-term members of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards and very good friends. Though we started out 180 degrees apart on this issue, and very much along the lines that Rabbi Broyde was just talking about, namely, I'm on the side of Asher Weiss, I guess, and he was on the side of Herschel Schachter. He was basically saying that that you must maintain a clinical medicine point of view, and you may never remove life support from somebody who can still benefit from it, even if it means that that person is terminal and is to use Michael's term, hogging the machines that other people could benefit from more efficiently and more and frankly just more. Whereas I said that in a pandemic kind of situation, you really have to move to a public health point of view and look at it from the point of view of other sources within our tradition that had to balance the welfare of the community versus the welfare of an individual. And so we ultimately, with really a wonderful cross-country chavruta, he lives in New York, I live in Los Angeles, a really wonderful cross-country chavruta for about 2 months, we decided to come to the same conclusion, although with very different reasoning. And you can find those tshuvot, as well as the other ones that I'm mentioning, on the website of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which I put into the chat. But if anybody wants to ask me afterward, I'd be happy to send that along after these sessions are over. I think the harder issues, frankly, were not the medical issues. They were the mental health issues. Just to quote to you a study that was done in April 2020, in other words, really in the very early stages of the pandemic in the United States, a study that was done by San Diego State University and Florida State University. In April 2020, more than 1 in 4 US adults met the criteria that psychologists use to diagnose serious mental distress and illness. That represents a roughly 700,000 increase from data collected in 2018. Meanwhile, roughly 70% of Americans experience moderate to severe mental distress, triple the rate seen in 2018. While this surge in mental distress showed up across age and demographic groups, young adults and those with children experience the most pronounced spikes. We're dealing with social isolation, anxiety around health, and economic problems. That's a perfect storm, the study said. That's April of 2020. And if anything, it got worse when the pandemic lasted much longer. So early on, I wrote I'm a past president of Jewish Family Service in Los Angeles, and I'm still on their board. And so I'm very much aware of a lot of the mental health issues that have arisen, major spikes in depression, in alcoholism, in family violence, all of this. And by the way, later on in suicide as well, but especially in the beginning, and those kinds of things. And so one of the things that became very clear is that we need each other, right? It's not good for a person to live alone, Genesis chapter 2, right? Or an ancient Jewish source, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. Barbara Streisand is only a few years older than I am, but my grandchildren in particular call me ancient, so I guess that's an ancient Jewish source. We really need social interaction. And so one of the things that we were saying very early on to our people is you really need, even if you cannot reach out and touch someone, you really need to reach out. And thankfully we have Zoom. I mean, I frankly don't know what this pandemic would have looked like without it. we would have lost years in education and years in social interaction, years in business for that matter, right? And so consequently, thank God for Zoom, but it's not the same as being in the same room together, right? And so one of the things that we said early on is that you really need to, you need to interact socially. And I personally had a number of Zoom conversations with high school friends I had not seen in decades. And I must say that that was really beneficial to me. And I hope to, to my friends from high school as well as the people that you know and love and that are in your circle of family and friends. You also need to get out of your circle, immediate circle, right? One of the things we discovered is you may really love your family, but maybe not 24/7. And that we all need to be able to get out and be with other people and be somewhat distant from, the people that you literally know and love. I've been married for 55 years and I'm not going anywhere, right? But I mean, it became very clear to me that both my wife and I needed to have interaction with other people in order our kids are grown and out of the house. So, I mean, we really need to pay attention to those kinds of mental health requirements. If anything, Judaism in particular, but not only Judaism, other religions as well, is one forum in which people normally get together and have these kinds of social interactions and mark the life cycle events, birth, adolescence, marriage, death, and are able to reinforce each other day by day, week by week, in terms of being a community. And those kinds of things, therefore, became really important in the Tshuvot that came out in the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. Things like, could you have a Zoom minyan? And it led to a long, there are a long series of Tshuvot in regard to what does a minyan mean? And could you have it, given the fact that we can now not just hear each other on the phone, but actually see each other through Zoom, is that sufficient to constitute a minyan? Then you had all the questions, well, what about, that's the weekday, what about Shabbat, right? And what happens if you use electricity on Shabbat? And we do have a tshuva from years ago about the permissibility of using electricity on Shabbat for things that are not otherwise prohibited. So I mean, not for doing business, for example, right? But if you are using Zoom on Shabbat, and there are conservative Jews and rabbis who do not, but if there are those who do, what does that mean? I mean, is live streaming different from Zooming? Because in live streaming, you're just watching things as opposed to interacting in the way that you do on Zoom. Are those separate? And if so, does that have to be set up before Shabbat? And all of those kinds of questions became very important for us. Things like one of the things that Michael just mentioned before, namely like, the first, I remember that we had Purim together, and then by Pesach, couldn't do it anymore in 2020. And what does the Seder look like? If you're on Zoom, could you do that on Zoom? What about all the restrictions on foods? What happens if you couldn't get to a grocery store in the years before the vaccines? What do you do in regard to the food restrictions for kashrut generally, but for Pesach all the more so? So all of those required Tshuvot, and they were being produced very quickly with much less scrutiny by the other members of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards than normally happens, but with at least some scrutiny. We had this fast track process, as it was called, where subcommittees would deal with it and not the full committee. And so those kinds of things, I think are really important. And now the question is, as Michael was just saying earlier, now the question is when, and there's actually a tshuva on this by Rabbi Joshua Heller, when halachically is the emergency over? What constitutes the end of the emergency, such that we go back to normal, whatever that means, right? And some of the things, interestingly, it's been true in education and in business as well. Some of the things that we've learned through this pandemic that we may well continue on. There has been far more adult education during pandemic via Zoom than there has been beforehand, because you didn't have to face the freeway or whatever it was. So you didn't have to face traffic, and you didn't have to waste time going to and from wherever the class was taking place. So are we going to continue that? The university where I work has this massive adult education program that became all the more massive as a result of Zoom, and is still continuing on that way. So I mean, is this going to be the same? But it's not the same as teaching around the table together in a room, right? So what part of this? And some people simply do not learn well online, and some people, especially I'm thinking now about public education, some people don't have online access altogether. So what is it? I mean, my wife has Parkinson's. We have a caregiver who's frankly poor, and her daughter doesn't have access to the web, right? So what does that mean in terms of how we're going to conduct public education for people who are not wealthy enough to be able to have internet access, right? All of those kinds of questions, I think, are really important in terms of how we as a Jewish community and in terms of Jewish law understand what we're going to do as the pandemic, God willing, retreats in our rearview mirror. And then what part of it are we going to learn from and continue on, and what part of it are we not? I just want to remind you that I put in the chat the website for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, where you'll be able to see a lot of these Tshuvot. You can also just simply go to the Rabbinical Assembly website, and they have a whole section there on COVID, and you can sort of see some of these things sort of organized that way. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'd be happy to hear questions.
Thank you, Elliot. I was unmuting for a second there. Maybe we'll just continue and work through all four papers, and then we will have time, ensure everybody has ample time for their presentation. So our third presenter is Joan Friedman, who's a professor of history and religious studies at the College of Wooster. She has a rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College. Her book on the approach to Responsa of Solomon Freehoff was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. And her talk today is entitled Between Safe and Safe Enough, Bodily Protection in the Pandemic. Joan, it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Joel. It's nice to you hear me. It's nice to see you again, and I have to say that it is quite an unexpected and undeserved honor to be sharing the same panel with the two predecessors whose work I have so often turned to. For the past couple of years, I have chaired the CCIR Responsa Committee, and I wanted to explain to everybody what the Responsa Committee is and how it works. The Central Conference of American Rabbis, the North American Association of Reform Rabbis, formed the Responsa Committee in 1906, at the time when the classical reform paradigm dominated the movement here. There was a fiery dispute over whether the rabbinic organization could or should set standards of ritual practice for its members and for their congregations. So a compromise was reached. They would create a committee for the sake of younger colleagues uncertain of what to do in matters of practice. They could do what has always been done, write to older men and men of learning and experience for an answer, and be guided in their conduct with due deference and reverence for such authority and information. And this met the approval of one of the grand old men of classical reform, David Phillipson, who noted if the rabbinic organization were to act on these responsa and make it an action of the conference, it might look like the offering of a new Shulchan Aruch. If they are simply the responsa of an individual or a committee of three, they remain an individual matter. I therefore represent a committee whose mission is to answer questions for those Reform Jews who want to be guided by us. We are committed to providing that guidance by reading the Halachic tradition through the lens of what we as Reform or liberal progressive Jews understand as our covenantal relationship to God. A century ago, Jacob Lauterbach characterized halacha as prophetic ethics applied to daily life. His student Solomon Freehoff followed this with the maxim that the halacha provides us with guidance, not governance. And my colleague Mark Wachowski has noted on many occasions, this committee does not compel Reform Jews to accept its guidance. Rather, we try to persuade them that this is guidance that they need and that they should heed as a part of an authentic Jewish life. So the first thing that I would like to point out is that we were actually asked a question, what guidelines to use for reopening as the pandemic wound down. And the very fact that the question was asked, I think, is a reflection of the changes in the reform movement. I am sure that 30 or 40 years ago, it would not have occurred to anybody to turn to the Responsa committee for this question. They simply would have relied on their own good judgment. But the idea that there are Jewish values and that those come out of a body of tradition is something that this movement is more and more open to considering. So we began with what we thought was an important element of mindset that maybe we've not talked about yet. The pandemic came as a shock to so many people because we are so accustomed to be able to fix everything, right? We are accustomed now to illness, to disease, to hospitals, hospices. We suffer and die from all kinds of frightening illness, but we are used to being able to think that we will tame or eliminate virtually all the contagious diseases that were a common feature of human existence until the last generation or two. You know, and the prospect of a new and deadly contagious illness, we think is particularly terrifying to many people, especially highly educated, affluent, first world types who are accustomed to being in control of their lives and of their environments. And what we were seeing anecdotally and from many of our colleagues was this sense of absolutely unreasoning panic and people being unwilling to relax even for the slightest, and being absolutely unwilling to chance even the slightest risk. I actually am a member of a conservative synagogue that parted ways with their clergy over this issue because basically the clergy were unwilling to come out of their home during the pandemic. So people, we were concerned with this perspective, and so our questioner asked us how to reopen safely given the obligation of pikuach nefesh. So we wanted to point out that yes, pikuach nefesh is an important consideration, but it does not actually tell us, other than, when you see somebody drowning, what actually constitutes pikuach nefesh. And so what we did was to frame a response about the necessity of balancing sakanat nefashot and shmirat guf. Okay, so the obligation to take care not to endanger the lives of others, based on the verse in Deuteronomy 22:8, that if you're building a house, you have to put a parapet around your roof, lest anybody fall and die. And this is understood down classically as sakanat nefashot. Is what you have to avoid for yourself and for others. You have to take reasonable precautions, in other words. But there is also the concern of shmirat haguf, and of course, nobody articulates this better than the Rambam, the physician. And I will not read the extensive quotes that we made, but the idea that one has an obligation to take the best care to preserve one's own health and one's own life, and to follow, medical advice, and not to diverge from it. So we have to take precautions to avoid obvious dangers to others. But we are also expected to take responsibility for our own safety, health, and well-being. And we read these as complementary, not as conflicting. And then said the community has the obligation to act to avert sakanat nefashot. So the community has the obligation to follow, to follow the best practices with regard to public health. We have to follow what the best public health authorities see, but what the best public health authorities say is not necessarily sufficient for a person who has some particular condition. Somebody who is immunocompromised may not be safe under the standards that are safe for the majority of the community. And so, we said we cannot lay down specifically detailed conditions for every congregation and for every particular situation, but we did say that that all of our congregations have the obligation, every individual has the obligation to preserve their own health and well-being, and that that includes, and here we relied on David Golinkin's tshuva about the COVID-19 vaccine, that this is refuah beduka, this is proven treatment, and that anybody who can get vaccinated, in other words, unless you have a medical reason preventing it, has an obligation to do so. And that the community has no obligation to arrange matters for the convenience of people who refuse to be vaccinated. And second, the community is not obligated to go beyond the standards set by public health authorities, but synagogue boards may decide on behalf of their particular circumstances to adhere to more stringent situations. But essentially, individuals cannot ask that the entire community adhere to their need or their perceived need for complete 100% security. We also tied this into questions about how are we going to reopen in terms of withdrawing what we considered emergency approval for virtual minyanim and so forth. But that's actually not part of my mandate here. So I will stop, and if I've stopped too short, then I hope that somebody else will be able to use this time.
Joel, are you available?
I'm unmuting myself. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Joan, so much. We have a nice cross-section of presentations from the range of, at least of many of their voices within contemporary Jewish thinking, halachic decision-making. And our final presenter kind of crosses over between both. I just recall personally having had met Alan at the last in-person session of the conference that took place in Scottsdale, I think 2 years ago.
2 years
And hopefully, soon in our day, we'll be able to again meet in person and have this conference. So again, we all benefit from Zoom. So if we're going to live in a world of hybridity, is kind of something to think about to come. Is this a kind of key lion that's acceptable? But in any case, our final presenter is Alan Jotkowitz, who is a physician who now lives in Israel for now over 20 years, is connected to Ben Gurion University and in medical school, and also is involved in extensively in Jewish medical ethics and the Jotkowitz Center for Jewish Ethics, and is still a practicing physician. And he added, as many of my panelists did, spoke of his family and kids and grandkids, which we've all also had connections with during this pandemic. And my pleasure then to introduce Dr. Jotkowitz, who will speak on the topic of making decisions on public health. Who has the legal authority? And before he starts, let me ask again, remind anybody, if you have any questions, please post them to the Q&A at this time. So Dr. Jotkowitz.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, let me try to share screen. Okay, let's see. Here we go. Let's just see if this is the one. 1 second. Let me just move this up. Also having that problem. Let's see. Do you want us to no?
Sometimes solving medical issues are easier.
Yes, I don't understand why this. Okay, but let's see, I'll start anyway. For some reason, it's not moving my, 1 second, let me try this new share. Okay, let's see what this is. Here we go. Oh, great. Okay, perfect. Okay, and let's see on the bottom there. Let's just see. For some reason, I can't. Okay, we'll have to go like this. Okay, well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Professor Samuelson and Lisa and Dawn really for their tremendous efforts in putting this conference together. Like others, like Joel mentioned, my last in-person, I said inpatient, Freudian slip, but my last conference was in Scottsdale 2 years ago, and I fondly remember it. Yeah, I'm unwittingly going to talk about some of the issues that my teachers and colleagues, Professor Wolpe, Efron, and Gilman spoke about in the keynote lecture. And I'm going to speak about the relationship between public health, religion, and COVID, and clearly they intersect on many levels. And I'm going to start with talking about and I'm going to compare Israel and America. I'm going to start by talking about a decision of the Supreme Court in November 2020. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn and Agudas Yisrael of America petitioned the United States Supreme Court against the New York State regulations that impose severe restrictions on attendance at religious service in geographic areas classified as red zones and orange zones. The petitioners maintain that these restrictions violate the free expression clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution, and the New York State directives treat houses of worship more harshly than comparable secular facilities. In an unsigned opinion, the majority of the court, Justice Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and in one of first Justice Amy Barrett's opinions, I think, sided with the applicants in order that the state's restrictions on religious services be enjoyed. They based their opinion on 3 reasons, which we will discuss more in depth. Firstly, they felt that the restrictions violated the minimum requirement of neutrality, which maintained that religion cannot be singled out for harsh treatment. The justice felt that the contested regulations would cause irreparable harm. And finally, the majority opinion maintains that it has not been shown that granting the applications will harm the public. Irreparable harm. So in the decision, it was exemplified by Catholics' inability to receive communion. And I have no ability to comment on the validity of that statement or no, that's for other experts in the Catholic tradition to talk about the harm by the inability to receive communion. But I can talk about the Jewish response, and the decision said important religious traditions in the Orthodox Jewish tradition that require personal attendance, and if we forbade them, it would cause irreparable harm. And my question is that really true? How many important religious traditions require personal attendance? Certainly going to the synagogue every day is a requirement for Jewish people, but it's not a Torah requirement. And many people can satisfy the requirement by praying at home. Weddings do not have to take place with a mass of people. Really, the minimum is 2 people with a rabbi. And, you know, you can have the parents, and that's enough to have a Jewish wedding. Funerals, again, interesting that they didn't go below 10. In Israel, they rarely went below 10 because 10 is the number of a minyan, of a tzibur. And, you know, again, how many religious events really need more than 10 or really cause irreparable harm if you can't do it? Torah learning can be done by Zoom. Prayer can be done by Zoom. So really, it was debatable to me how true that statement is. And even is it irreparable? You know, in Judaism, we have the concept of tshuva. You know, if you miss a minyan, how irreparable that damage is, that's really all open to debate for me. And the Supreme Court should state that these important religious traditions, Orthodox Jewish tradition, require personal attendance, might be beyond the capability of the court to make that decision for Orthodox Jews. But that's only one side of the coin. True, even if we accept that there are these important religious traditions, but there's something even more important in Judaism. And Professor Friedman mentioned it, and the previous speakers, the importance, the supreme value of saving lives is the watchword of Judaism, according to Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. You know, it trumps all the other values, you know, except the big 3. You know, idolatry worship, we're not talking about illicit relations and murder, but that's not what we're talking about. All the rituals of Judaism are trumped by the importance to save lives. And Rabbi Meir Twersky, who happens to be Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandson, said, one who makes light of the mandate of Pekuach Nefesh, saving lives, is not only making light of one isolated halacha, rather he is guilty of distorting and perverting the entire Torah. So if you mistakenly think ritual is more important than saving lives in Judaism, it's not simply a mistake. It's a perversion of the Torah, which is really a cardinal sin in Judaism and something from which there is no repentance, according to the Rambam. The Justice Gorsuch has his own opinion. He wrote his own opinion. He writes, at a minimum, the amendment prohibits government officials from treating religious exercises worse than comparable secular activities. The governor has chosen to impose no capacity restrictions on certain businesses he considers essential. And it turns out the businesses the governor considers essential includes hardware stores, acupuncturists, liquor stores, bicycle repair shops, accountants, lawyers, insurance agents. So at least according to the governor, it may be unsafe to go to church, but it's always fine to pick up another bottle of wine, shop for a new bike, or spend the afternoons exploring your distal points and meridians. Who knew public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience? So the argument between Justice Gorsuch, the core of the argument between Justice Gorsuch and Governor Cuomo is how essential one feels religious services are. They're becoming a value judgment as opposed to a legal or ethical opinion, probably heavily influenced by personal religious feelings and practice of each justice. As Justice Gorsuch writes in his opinion, The only explanation for treating religious places differently seems to be a judgment that what happens there just isn't as essential as what happens in secular spaces. Indeed, the governor is remarkably frank about this. In his judgment, laundry and liquor, travel and tools are essential, while traditional religious exercises are not. So again, how much of this is a legal question or really a question of values of what is considered ethical, essential, and who should make that decision? In the dissenting opinion, signed by Justice Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, the justices state, we have previously recognized the courts must grant elected officials broad discretion when they undertake to act in areas fraught with medical and scientific uncertainties. And now they make a theoretical point and a practical point. That is because the Constitution principally entrusts the safety and the health of the people to the political accountability officials of the state. The elected officials are responsible for the public health of the citizens, not the court. And the second point is the elected branches of state and national government can marshal scientific expertise and craft specific policies in response to changing facts on the ground. And they can do so more quickly than can courts. I don't even know if the courts have the ability to do it. To make a complicated public health decision, you need the expertise of a lot of experts, the CDC, which is a federal, Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, which is a federal. These are all under the auspices of the federal government. And these experts are supposed to give advice to the elected officials to make their decisions. The court does not have at their exposure all these organizations, and do they have the time to sort through all this information? So those are the 2 points that the dissenters made. One, it's not their purview, the safety, and 2, they don't have the necessary expertise. The opinion continues. Members of the scientific and medical communities tell us that the virus is transmitted from person to person through respiratory droplets produced when the person or group of people talk, sing, cough, or breathe. Thus, according to the experts, the risk of transmission is higher when people are in close contact with another for prolonged periods of time. The nature of the epidemic, the spikes, the uncertainties, the need for quick action taken together mean the state has countervailing arguments based upon health, safety, and administration considerations that must be balanced against the applicant's First Amendment challenges. In the dissent, they do relate to the scientific evidence that was not really related to in the original opinion. They go on. Undeterred, Justice Gorsuch offers up his own examples of secular activities he thinks might pose similar risks, which are treated more leniently, going to the liquor store, getting a bike repaired. But Justice Gorsuch doesn't even try to square this example with the condition medical experts tell us facilitate the spread of COVID. Large groups of people gathering, speaking, and singing in close proximity indoors for extended periods of time. So this is more of a scientific critique of the majority opinion, which voted to overturn the opinion of the New York State. Chief Justice Roberts wrote his own opinion, and his basic point is, like the dissenters, our Constitution principally entrusts the safety and health of the people to the political accountable officials of the state to guard and protect. And then Justice Kavanaugh, in his defense, writes, federal courts therefore must afford substantial deference to state and legal authorities about how to best balance competing public policy considerations during the pandemic. That everyone accords to. But he goes on, but judicial deference is an emergency or a crisis, does not mean wholesale judicial abdication, especially when important questions of religious discrimination, racial discrimination, free speech, or the like are raised. So according to Justice Kavanaugh, these other issues trump the public health considerations that the dissenters were referring to. What about the Israeli experience? So the secular and religious communities tended to follow the instructions of the government regarding lockdowns and school closures. This, again, is related to just following the law like any citizen is required to do. But the national religious communities also have an element of the sanctity of the government. There's a belief among certain segments of religiousized community that the government has an element of holiness and kedusha, and their decisions also have the force of Jewish law, just by the fact that they're a Jewish government in sovereign Israel. Ultra-Orthodox communities followed their religious leaders' instructions as opposed to government directives for the most part. And this is the crucial issue. Ultra-Orthodox schools were kept open and for the most part, and testing guidelines were not followed. So I am not getting into the whole conflict we discussed before. We're not discussing here responsibility for the pandemic and blame. That's not the issue I want to get to. The simple fact that was ultra-Orthodox schools were open and secular and national religious schools were closed. And for my family, it was a very difficult decision. I live on a block in a mixed community in Beit Shemesh, in single family houses, large houses where on one block is Haredi families and national religious families. And my children and grandchildren were with us, 4 working parents who had to scramble every day for daycare for their children. They were all essential workers with 4 children. And every day was a scramble and a struggle while the Haredi children were walking down the block to school. So that's a question of blame. It's just a question of can a society function with those 2 realities occurring at the same time. So now I want to show that maybe if a picture is worth 1,000 words, maybe a video is worth more than that. And I hope this works. So this is, okay, let's see. We'll try to open this. Oops.
No.
You need to turn the sound up on the.
Here we go. So this was the that was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the largest national religious yeshiva, Har Etzion, and it's empty because the yeshiva followed the instructions of the Gemara of the government to close immediately when the government gave the decision to close. And let's just hope I can get to the next video. Let's see. Okay, the technology problems. Here we go. Let's see what's popping up here. Okay, no.
Eren, I think you should need to share sound before you.
Oh,
play.
you weren't able to hear that? Okay, let me just see. I think I'm not gonna be able to go to my next video, but okay, that's all right. I was worried about this technology having to work. Let's just see. What do we have here? No. Okay, let's just see here. Okay, don't say save. Okay, let's just see. Let me try to share screen again. Let's just see. Excuse me for 1 second. Let's just see PowerPoint. Okay, so that was the response, but in the ultra-Orthodox community, that wasn't the response of their leaders. For the most part, the schools remained open, and I had a video of how that actually went on. How the decision making was made, and it's funny. I looked for the video, but that video was taken off the YouTube. I couldn't find it. They would go to the ultra Orthodox leader Rabbi Kanevsky, who died a year ago, and they would ask him, through a. Did people see this now or no? People see my slide?
No.
No? Okay, let me try to share.
No,
Share
there's also,
slide. Yeah.
Alan, there's also
Yeah.
a bad echo. If you can just stay with one mode, and if we cannot see the video, that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can't get to that. Okay. So I will just go on now and speak. So again, it was how the decision making was made. His grandson would come and he would speak to him, and he would answer in one word answers to keep the school open. So the question is, how much consideration was made in that decision? What was the decision-making process? All those questions are open for debate. But Rabbi Kanevsky was not the only voice in the ultra-Orthodox community, as Professor Broyde spoke about. Rabbi Asher Weiss was even more strict than the government, and he said even when the government said we could open, we needed to close the schools and close the synagogue. So, what was the theological justification for the Haredi response? So, I think there's a few elements in it. One is based on the principle of Dat Torah, that they believe in this almost supernatural ability of the religious leaders, not only to decide halachic questions, but to decide political questions, socioeconomic questions, and also medical questions. And that's who their allegiance is to. Other issues are that they felt that by studying Torah and prayer, that's a response to the pandemic, that they could fight the pandemic through those mechanisms. They also had a lack of confidence in the secular government. Their question is, who would they really look to for do they follow the secular government, or do they follow their religious leaders? There's also questions of Shomer Psayim Hashem, a principle that God protects the fools. So all these theological issues, and also a healthy skepticism about science and technology. So all these issues came together in the ultra-Orthodox response to the pandemic, not in terms of blaming for the pandemic, but in terms of their own personal response to listen to their leaders as opposed to the government's directives. So now, if we want to compare the American and Israeli response, there's some, in these issues, when religious questions were put up, so the Catholic Church and the Gudas Yisrael went to the Supreme Court for their questions. They worked within the system. The Israeli ultra-Orthodox worked not through the system, but separate from the system. And so that's the thing where there was different. And then the question is, they both had a skepticism in both communities about the scientific evidence. In the American question, there were political questions. In the Israeli questions, there were separate questions. And the question that really needs to be considered is, what is this future of this response? What does this portend for both America and Israel? There's going to be more contentious issues that come upon, where religion and public health and legal issues conflict. And is this just the purview of what the future holds? The question of the composition of the Supreme Court, the question of the abortion coming before the Supreme Court, are questions in America has to deal with. In Israel, the questions has to do is, what's going to be the relationship to authority of the ultra-Orthodox community? Are they going to continue to look to their rabbis for support? And the question is, how Israeli society is going to look about. People talked about that reflecting open rebellion. And, in my community, schools were open and really nothing was being done to the schools, even though it was against the law of the land. So how is the future going to deal with these issues? It's something that important issues for both societies. So that was sort of what I wanted to talk about today, the question of a relationship between religion and public health when there are conflicts, who to go to for the decision making, and what does the future portend for these controversial issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan, for your presentation. I saw a few questions here that at least indirectly related to what was said. Let me read them first, and then maybe I'll pose a question. I think this is more for Elliot. Somebody wrote, all these changes in Zoom and in the conservative movement have made it much much easier to share with others. I guess that's what it says, and share from home. I don't know if you have any thoughts to say on that in general.
Yeah, well, frankly, on the educational part of this, that's a real boon because, again, in synagogues as well as in other venues as well, there have been many more people participating in various kinds of Jewish education on an adult level that never did so before. So that's a boon. But rabbis are really worried about whether people will come back to shul again once they have been able to attend shul simply in their homes on Zoom. It's sort of like that song from Oklahoma, will you ever be able to bring them back to the farm once they've been in Paris, right? Or something like that. And I think rabbis are really worried about that actually, because it's just too easy to be in, where in your own home and you don't have to travel anywhere and all of that. My own view is that people will, I'm already seeing this in terms of my own community, people are sort of sick of Zoom, frankly, and are willing to spend the extra time and effort it takes to be back together again. My synagogue happens to own a field right next to it. And so we've been actually coming together outdoors and it's Los Angeles, so the weather allows it. We've been able to come together outdoors for a number of months now. And people are really happy to do that. I'm hoping that that more and more people will be able to, will be seeing the real advantage of being together in a room together, being able to talk together, to share kiddush together. I mean, all of that, which you can't do on Zoom. And I love music. You simply cannot sing together on Zoom. You just can't do it, right? So I'm hoping that along with all of the other advantages of being together literally will bring people back.
Thank you. Joan, I had there's a question for you, not directly on the topic, but I think interesting, might relate to what you said about the scope of the Responsa committee. And it had to do with issues of sexual harassment, et cetera, that came to light in the reform movement. And I suppose the person was asking, has this become an issue that's been addressed in the Responsa committee, or I suspect other agents within the CCIR have been dealing with it? But if you have any comments on that.
I will just say briefly that the entire reform movement has had all of its various branches has had recently some very, very, very thorough and frank investigations of sexual misconduct in all of its constituents. It's really unfortunate that so much was turned up, but it's good that it is being addressed. The CCIR has an ethics process, so it would come, it would come to us if somebody had a question about what we were doing, but we do not proactively say, this is what you have to do. So no.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take a stab at asking a question, and something that you brought up, Joan, but about vaccine mandates. But I'm curious, both maybe also on the one side about vaccine mandates, but also from a Jewish perspective of the legitimacy of a heter, or somehow granting permission not to be vaccinated. And what do we make of, and maybe all three panelists can speak of this, and maybe Alan from a medical perspective, of people claiming religious exemption from vaccines. So since you're on the screen, Joe, maybe I'll start with you and we'll just go around. Unless you want to think about it.
No, it's okay. And I also, first of all, I also teach at a small private liberal arts college that required all returning students to be vaccinated unless they had a medical exemption or a religious exemption. And I have no idea if any of our students claimed religious exemption, but I cannot imagine in a Jewish context how anybody could claim a medical exemption to not be vaccinated, and it absolutely makes no sense. So no, and we specifically want. I mean, Rapo pay, and here it is. That it's absurd. And so, and we also, by the way, have a responsum from some years ago on compulsory immunization for religious school students. Similarly, so no, it's a nonsensical question. Okay, but we
Thank
wanted
you.
to make clear, and I know anecdotally that of at least one congregation where this has come up, where people say, I refuse to be vaccinated, and essentially we wanted to make sure that our rabbis had the backing to say, that's baloney, and we're not going to pay attention to you.
Okay, Michael, or thoughts there?
I was astonished by Joan's answer because it sounded almost orthodox. It denied the plurality of a person's religious views and seemed to me to the antithesis of reform. Reform doesn't think that the Jewish tradition compels much of anything. It doesn't require that you keep kosher or keep Shabbat, but it requires that you be vaccinated. I found it very astonishing, but I smiled when I heard it, because maybe next Reform Judaism will require so many more things. I think the Jewish tradition views this as just a medical question, and it's not a Jewish law question at all. Everybody is obligated to follow the best advice given to them by the physician of their choice, and that's all that Jewish law requires of you. If your physician says, due to the totality of your medical circumstance, you are better off not being vaccinated, then Jewish law says you should not get vaccinated, and that's a religious exemption, Joan, not a medical exemption. That's a religious exemption, not a medical one.
No, I think it actually, Michael, I really do think that's a medical exemption. That's your doctor telling you not to be vaccinated, not your rabbi.
But your legal society might decide that your doctor is not giving you correct advice and deny you a medical exemption. You get to pick your physician in Jewish law. And when the overall medical establishment says you must get vaccinated and your doctor does not, I'm not sure that Jewish law requires that you be vaccinated. What do you think of that?
Well,
I disagree with you, Michael.
Well, maybe have Elliot to that one. Okay.
All right. I mean, I don't think that there is a Jewish religious reason not to be vaccinated. Not only I, but the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards said that literally unanimously. We very seldom are unanimous on anything. We're Jews after all, and rabbis beyond that. So we're used to argumentation, but on that issue, we were completely unanimous. That said, I mentioned before that I'm on the board of Jewish Family Service, and one of the issues that we faced was that, and we have a number of social workers and others who work for Jewish Family Service who are not Jewish. So that's yet another piece of this. But even among our Jewish social workers, there is some Orthodox rabbi in the San Fernando Valley who is signing these letters saying that there's a Jewish reason to not to be vaccinated. I have to tell you, I think that's just simply a complete misreading of the Jewish tradition, especially for a pandemic. Right?
I agree
We're talking
with you,
about,
Elliot.
Michael, let me finish this one thought.
Sure.
Especially for a pandemic, when we're talking about a contagious disease, where we have to take into account not only your health, but the health of everybody else around you. And Judaism is much more communitarian than the American ideology is. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I have liberty. I'm an individual with rights in the American tradition. In the Jewish tradition, I'm a member of community with duties. And I think especially when we're talking about a communicable disease, that communitarian understanding of things really has to come to the fore.
So, but Elliot, I want to give you a case to think about, a case that I dealt with at Emory on a committee. I have a patient with cancer that's 3 years old. The medical consensus is that this person benefits from vaccination, but there's a medical minority which says the person is better off not being vaccinated.
Okay.
No, I want you to focus on it, Elliot. Don't punt.
No, I'm not
Emory
talking at
said
all.
this person is not entitled to a medical exemption.
No.
This person is
When
not
it is-
entitled to a medical exemption since the medical consent.
Michael, we're not, can I say something? We're not
No.
talking about those wild.
Whoa, let
Why?
Mike.
Wild cases are what
Talking
make
about
us wild.
99%. Let 99%. I'm the only doctor here. Everyone should get vaccinated. 99% of the population. Yes, that individual is a different case. 99% everyone should get vaccinated medically. And number two, because of that, halacha requires everyone to get vaccinated. Both hats.
Does halacha require that somebody get vaccinated who it's counter medical for?
Well,
The case is a 3-year-old. Yes, that can be dealt with at the individual level. That's not what we're talking about here.
But why aren't we talking? I don't have a problem, Alan. You and I agree in the real world, but let's focus on the case of a person who you think is entitled to a medical exemption. Do you think, Elliot, that person needs to be vaccinated for the sake of the community against their medical advice?
I think that there is room to recognize that on a number of issues, doctors can disagree with each other just as much as rabbis can.
That's right.
And when doctors disagree with each other, then it really does depend upon the particular doctors at the bedside who are treating that patient. Right. And I think that that's fine. I mean, I think that we should recognize that in particular cases, Alan said 1%, I leave it to him. All right. In very rare
less
cases.
than, Elliot, much less than 1%.
Much less
than 1%. I agree.
Okay.
It's much less than 1%, but I want to know.
That's what we're talking about.
Sure, but let's focus on the 1%, Alan. Let's focus on the 1/10 of 1%.
Yeah, okay, that's a question we could talk about. Fine, there's two sides.
Is that a medical exemption or a religious exemption, Elliot?
No, that's a medical exemption.
Yeah, I agree. That's a medical exemption.
Okay.
But Michael, the way I understood you could.
May I say a word, please?
Go ahead, Michael.
Not 1%, but the whole range of people with all sorts of rare and mysterious and complicated conditions, when doctors are not in one opinion, like past of anaphylaxis. So there could be medical controversies. And I smell a risk here that we go to a rabbi to resolve a medical controversy or doubt. And this doesn't work that much. I mean, there are a group of people whose doctors are not sure about the risk of vaccine. And I don't see how a rabbi or halacha would step in and tell them, well, go on that side or the other.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. I think we agree, Michael.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, I guess the question in some way is, what if it's a consensus, but not a unanimity of medical professionals? So what I understood, you just said, like Broyde to be saying, is that from a halachic perspective, halakha empowers an individual to find a physician. And if the physician says you don't have to do it, that's halachically acceptable. It's a halachic legitimation of empowering a medical physician.
Right, but
I
on
agree with
vaccination for COVID, there's no controversies. It's just the kooks who say, from a medical standpoint, there's no controversy for a normal person, right? An elderly person, there's no controversy. So we're not.
What about for a 3-year-old, Alan? Controversy or no controversy?
Complicated. That's again because that protects other people, right? That's a case that we could talk about too, which is a very interesting.
So I want to note there are lots of people actually. If society is made up of people between the ages of 0 and 100, about 4% of the population is in the age group where it's unclear if vaccinations are for their benefit or for the benefit of society. Those are everybody under 5. So Alan, when you said it was 1%, actually now we agree it's about 4%.
I was talking about adults.
I'm so sorry. Adults are the only people in this conversation. I'm confused. I was talking about people.
Okay.
So it's about 5% of the population that we're talking about here. Halacha allows a person to choose a physician and follow their advice.
Okay.
But see, Michael, if you're talking about children under 5, then the medical community is at 1 in saying that at least until now, Pfizer is actually, and so is Moderna, but Pfizer is now submitting to the CDC some evidence of the effectiveness and safety of their vaccine at a particular dosage to children under 5. So your case may be moved within another couple of weeks, but even if it's not, right, then you're talking about what the medical community as a whole is saying is or is not safe for people under 5. Until now, we've said that it's not safe for people under 5. So then under those circumstances, they should not be immunized. Exactly right.
So
Exactly
I think
right.
Joel summarized my position very well. My view goes as follows. Halacha gives a person the right to choose a reputable physician of their own choosing and follow that person's reputable advice, even if that person's view of the medicine is not the majoritarian view.
Okay, but then the question is, what does reputable mean?
I agree. Licensed physician, and they should lift licenses from anybody who doesn't give reputable advice.
Correct. Okay.
I mean,
more tolerant than this. There is the halacha of הירא ורך הלבב. And that opinion, כל מי שמי רגליים נופלים. So often there are people who are terrified of the vaccine. It's irrational, but they are terrified. They are not abusive of the system. They don't follow conspiracy. And there's a good ground to accept, based on the Jewish sources, that such people who are personally terrified, they're not against vaccine policy, but there are reasons to believe that they might be severely harmed by the vaccine, that halacha accept this position as legitimate. There is more to talk about it.
There is.
There's no controversy that vaccines are good in medicine.
Right.
But, and if you see what Rav Kook said and other authorities, the application of medical decision-making to individual cases is much more questionable from the perspective of Jewish law than we tend to assume, and sometimes arrogantly.
Interesting. Elliot, how do you respond to that comment? That's an interesting halachic approach.
Well, I mean, I think I take mental health very seriously, and the question really becomes, on a lot of these mental health issues, vis-a-vis, by the way, all kinds of things in medicine, not just this. I mean, you know, things like cosmetic surgery and things on that order, right? To what extent is the physical act the appropriate response to the mental problem, and to what extent should there be a mental health response to the problem? So if the person is terrified of vaccines, right, but the vaccine is going to keep that person alive as well as a lot of other people alive, then maybe the response should be a psychiatric response rather than a medical response, right? I mean, at least to begin with. And I guess, I mean, we are, you know, our mental health issues and our physical health issues are really entwined with each other. And on any given case, you could go in one direction or another. But I mean, I think, Michael, the issue that you're raising is a very important one. I mean, because certainly in our tradition, by the way, very different from American medicine in the middle of the 20th century, which is very much influenced by the mind-body dichotomy that you get back to Plato, right, in Western thought, the mind-body dichotomy, and then where are they connected? Descartes thought that it was the pineal gland, that was the magic place where the mind and the body were connected, right? But you get that really sort of pervaded medicine in the middle of the 20th century, where doctors were effectively, car mechanics. I mean, sort of, and we're treating only the physical body. In the early 1990s, I was on a curriculum committee at UCLA Medical School, actually, which created a program called Doctoring, and the group who created it were 4 Jewish physicians, interestingly. A program called Doctoring that every UCLA medical student has to take all 4 years of medical school. And it deals with the non-physical aspects of being a doctor through a series of cases. So the first case, for example, is a 15-year-old woman comes into your office complaining about stomach problems. You examine her, you find out that she has no stomach problems whatsoever. She's just pregnant. Now, frankly, from a physical point of view, it would be better if she were 18 or so. But if she's 15 and otherwise in good health and gets good prenatal care, physically, she probably will be okay. But she is Hispanic and Catholic and unmarried. So what does that mean in the Hispanic community? Will she be kicked out of the house? Probably not. In an early generation, if she were Irish, she would go to a home for unwed mothers, right? But will she, given that she's Catholic, probably an abortion is off the table, but what will happen to the child once the child is born? Will she keep it? Will she give it up for adoption? Where's the guy in all of this, right? And the doctor needs to at least know about those kinds of things, because all of those factors affect her health. And so the doctoring program talks about the economics of medicine, the sociology of medicine, religious issues, ethical issues, all kinds of stuff, right? That doctors need to know, because we as human beings are not simply bodies. We are people, and as people, we have all of these various kinds of connections. So yes, I mean, somebody who has a real fear of being vaccinated, the question is, well, how should that fear be addressed? And I mean, I certainly don't think that you tie them down and vaccinate. I don't think you do that. Okay. But I do think that there really does need, given that we're talking about a communicable disease, I think that there is a real community need to try to get as many people who are eligible to be vaccinated.
I think I want to, it's a good note to wrap up on. I want to thank all our panelists, and perhaps to lighten the mood, to follow up on Elliot's comment about Descartes. Descartes walked into the bar, and the barkeeper turns to him and says, "Would you like a drink?" And Descartes responds, "I think not," and he disappears. And with that, I'll end the session, and I wish you all a wonderful afternoon.